That mountain sits there silent and cold, watching us like a hawk, waiting for a single mistake to swallow a man whole forever. You might reckon you know danger, but this peak has a hunger that has been growing for decades, feeding on souls who dare. It stands 28,169 feet in the air, a height where the angels fear to tread and devils play. Being the third tallest giant on this earth means nothing when the wind howls like a banshee and the air turns to ice. Commercial jets cruise just a bit higher, yet here you are with your feet on the ground, gasping for air that isn't there. You are standing at 80% the height of a flying machine, exposing your fragile flesh to a sky that wants to kill. Up there, the air is so thin it feels like someone is sitting on your chest, squeezing the life out of your lungs. Your body starts to shut down piece by piece, starving for the sweet breath of life that we all take for granted down here. They call it the death zone for a reason, 'cause up that high, you are essentially dying slowly with every single step you take. Other mountains might let you walk a bit, but this beast is relentless and cruel, demanding payment in sweat and sometimes in blood. From the bottom to the jagged top, it never lets up, pushing you past the breaking point until your mind starts to fracture. It saves the absolute worst torment for the very end, just when you think you have nothing left to give to the mountain. The final 600 feet require you to climb slick rock while your brain is screaming and your vision starts to go dark. Imagine trying to solve a puzzle while someone holds your head underwater. That is what technical climbing feels like in the death zone. Your mind is slowly dying from the lack of oxygen, yet you must move your hands and feet with the precision of a surgeon. Altitude isn't the only killer, because this mountain brews its own storms, whipping up a fury that can blind a man in seconds. It sits right where the monsoon weather hits first, shrinking your window of survival down to a tiny sliver of time in May. You only get a few weeks to dance with the devil before the skies open up and unleash a hell upon the slopes. Storms roll in without a whisper of warning, trapping folks in a whiteout so thick you cannot see your own hand in front. When that white fog descends, navigation becomes a fool's errand, and the path home disappears into a void of endless, freezing white nothing. Hanging glaciers loom over the route like giant guillotines, waiting to drop tons of crushing ice on anyone foolish enough to walk beneath. Rockfall starts to pick up as that afternoon sun warms the mountain, loosening the ice's grip and sending stone missiles raining down from above. This mountain is so desolate that it takes 15 long days of brutal hiking just to reach the base camp, far from civilization. There are no roads here, no lodges to rest your weary head, just an endless expanse of rock and ice that does not care. If something goes wrong up there, rescue is nearly impossible, leaving you to face the cold and the dark completely on your own. So, when he decided to attempt the summit in May of 2023, he knew exactly what kind of nightmare he was entering. But you have to understand, this wasn't just another climb for him to check off a list. This was something burning in his soul. This was his dream, a vision that had been haunting his sleep and calling his name through the wind for over 30 years. He wanted to be the very first person to ski all the way down from the summit, gliding over the face of death itself. He had already skied down 7 of the world's highest mountains, carving his path through the snow where others were too afraid to tread. This descent was going to be his absolute masterpiece, the final stroke of genius on a canvas painted with jagged ice and courage. So in the spring of 2023, he arrived at that desolate base camp with his skis strapped tight to his weathered pack. He had a plan that had been decades in the making, crafted with the patience of a spider weaving a web across an abyss. He was not traveling with a commercial team this time, just a solitary man standing against the crushing weight of the silent mountain. He booked his base camp services through a local company, but above that invisible line in the snow, he was completely on his own. No personal guide to hold his hand, no bottled oxygen to keep his blood warm, just him and the screaming, thinning air up there. It was just him, those 2 planks of wood and fiberglass, and a haunting dream that might just be a death wish in disguise. But he wasn't completely alone in that frozen wasteland, because at base camp he met a climber from Peru who shared his quiet madness. She was also attempting to climb the beast without extra oxygen, another soul willing to gamble their breath against the will of the sky. They both spoke the same language and hit it off immediately, finding a dark comfort in the shared shadow of the looming peaks above. They decided to team up for the final push, sharing a thin nylon tent and precious fuel to try and lighten their heavy loads. It was a partnership born out of cold necessity, a dark pact made between two souls trying to cheat death on the high ice. On May 18th, they launched their first assault, crawling out of their shelters like insects trying to defy the crushing weight of the sky. They spent days dragging their bodies from camp to camp, forcing their lungs to accept the thin and poisoned air of the upper atmosphere. When they finally reached the high camps, it felt like the mountain might actually let them pass through its iron gates without a fight. Everything seemed to be going according to the plan, but the mountain has a way of twisting hope into a cruel and sharp knife. The team responsible for fixing the safety ropes on the most dangerous sections took a wrong turn and led the climbers into a trap. They led the entire group of desperate climbers away from the summit path and straight into a steep snow gully that was a dead end. It was a vertical coffin, a steep gully that offered nothing but a long fall, stopping them cold just beneath the elusive summit. Most folks would have packed up and gone home right then, thanking their lucky stars they did not die in that frozen cul-de-sac. You don't just casually try to climb a monster like Kangchenjunga twice in one season, unless you have a death wish or something worse. The mountain beats you down physically and mentally until you are nothing but a hollow shell of meat and bone shivering in the dark. Your body usually needs weeks to recover from that kind of torture in the death zone, rebuilding the blood cells that the altitude destroyed. But he didn't turn back. Instead, he went all the way down to base camp, carrying his failure around his neck like a heavy stone. On the way down, he strapped those skis on and carved a line through the snow, proving to everyone he still had the fire. He called his wife back in Germany and told her the snow was perfect, his voice trembling with an excitement that masked the danger. He rested for only 3 measly days at base camp, barely enough time for a bruise to heal, let alone a tired human heart. His muscles were still screaming, and his blood was still thin, but the forecast showed one last window opening before the monsoon storms arrived. He knew better than anyone that weather windows in the Himalayas don't wait for any man. They snap shut like the jaws of a trap. The monsoon season was breathing down his neck, and if he didn't go right now, he would have to wait another year to die. At 54 years old, staring up at that white beast, you have to wonder how many more chances life is going to give you. So on May 22nd, he turned his back on safety and started climbing straight back into the throat of the beast one more time. She was going up with him, both of them drawn like moths to a flame, unable to resist the siren call of the summit. They looked each other in the eye and agreed on one last shot at glory, ignoring the warnings screaming in their tired bones. By May 24th, they had crawled their way back up to Camp 4, sitting on the edge of the world waiting for the night. He sent a message to his wife through the satellite void, telling her everything was fine, a lie we tell to comfort the living. He said he was starting his push at 6 in the evening, a time that makes the blood run cold in any climber's veins. Any sane person knows that 6 p.m. is a death sentence, because you should be leaving at midnight to catch the morning light. Starting that late meant he would reach the top as the sun was dying, forcing him to descend into the pitch-black, absolute darkness. Maybe his mind was already clouding over, or maybe he had a secret plan, but he made a very specific promise before he left. He told her to wait for him at Camp 4 after she reached the summit, to be his anchor in the coming storm. He made her promise to keep that radio turned on, saying he would call her down the wire when he started his descent. It was an insurance policy against the dark, a desperate safety net woven from hope just in case the mountain decided to bite. On the night of May 24th, they walked out of their tent and into a darkness so deep it felt like a grave. The conditions that night were simply brutal, with deep snow swallowing their legs and trying to drag them down into the frozen earth. Every single step on those steep slopes was a gamble, where one tiny slip would send you falling into a bottomless black void. The air was so thin up there that sucking in a breath felt like trying to breathe through a straw pinched almost shut. Both of them kept pushing forward into the night, fighting for every inch of ground with a stubborn refusal to just lay down. As they climbed higher into the death zone, she noticed something that should have sent a shiver of warning straight down her spine. He was moving slower than she had ever seen him move before, dragging his body as if invisible chains were holding him back. The mountain was taking everything he had, demanding a payment in blood and sweat just to lift one heavy boot past the other. At high noon on May 25th, 2023, she finally reached the summit, standing tall at 28,169 feet. It was the third highest point on this earth, and she stood there victorious without sipping a single breath of that bottled oxygen. It was a fantastic achievement, a moment of pure glory snatched from the jaws of a mountain that usually only deals in death. She took a few blurry photos to prove she was there, catching her breath and savoring the taste of victory for a moment. Meanwhile, he was still down below, pushing his body upward through air so thin that every single breath felt like a conscious struggle. She waited up there as long as she could, but as the afternoon wore on, the weather began to turn mean and ugly. She made the agonizing decision to start her descent, and here is the moment that would come to haunt her dreams forevermore. As she was making her way down, around 27,000 feet, she saw a lone figure climbing up toward her on the route. It was him, and they met on that narrow ridge, facing each other on one of the most dangerous sections of the mountain. They stopped on that knife-edge ridge, looking at each other, while the wind screamed warnings that only the dying can truly hear and understand. Even talking up there exhausts you, stealing precious air from your lungs, but they needed to confirm the plan before the darkness fell. It was late afternoon, and the weather was rotting away, turning into a beast that would swallow any rational climber in a heartbeat. Any sane man would have turned around right then, running back to safety before the mountain closed its jaws on his fragile neck. But he looked her right in the eye, or where her eyes would be behind those goggles, and told her to wait below. He told her to keep that radio on at Camp 4, swearing he could make the summit and get back down alive tonight. She nodded her head and continued her long descent, leaving him there to climb alone into the gathering gloom of the death zone. She had no reason to worry yet, because he was one of the best high-altitude climbers walking the face of this frozen earth. If anyone could handle a late summit and a descent in the pitch-black night, it was the man standing before her now. So she went down and he went up, and that was the last time anyone would ever see him alive in this world. But I am getting ahead of the tragedy, because around 5 in the afternoon, he finally stood on top of the world. He was the very last soul to touch the summit of Kangchenjunga that day, standing alone while the sun began to bleed away. He had done it, conquering the beast after a failed attempt and decades of dreaming about this exact frozen moment in time. He stood on his 10th peak over 26,000 feet, an achievement that should have been the crown jewel of his life. Everyone else had already fled down the mountain, racing past the high camps to find safety in the thick air below. But he knew she was waiting for him at Camp 4, a beacon of hope in a world that was turning dark. He wasn't completely alone up there, or at least that is what he told himself as he turned to face the long descent. Both altitude cerebral edema and altitude pulmonary edema are killers that creep up on you like a thief in the silent night. These conditions destroy your ability to think straight, convincing your dying brain that everything is perfectly fine while you are slowly fading away. It is like being blackout drunk, but feeling sober, making terrible choices that sound like genius ideas to your waterlogged and dying mind. You might believe you are walking downhill towards safety, but in reality, you are climbing higher into the crushing grip of the sky. You might think camp is just around the next bend, when in truth you are miles away and drifting further into the void. Your brain is literally drowning in its own fluid, swelling inside your skull, yet you feel strangely fine as the lights go out. Maybe that is why he climbed higher instead of lower, never reaching the skis he had stashed so carefully for his ride down. Maybe that is why he told her he would arrive in 2 hours, when he was actually moving away from salvation with every step. His brain was betraying him in the cruelest way possible, painting a false reality while his body slowly froze into a statue of ice. I think about those final lonely hours a lot, wondering what ghosts he saw dancing in the snow before the end finally came. Alone in the dark at 27,500 feet, with the storm raging like a wild animal tearing at his freezing skin, his judgment was worsening with every single breath. Yet the cruel thing is, he probably felt okay as the darkness closed in tight. He probably thought he was making good decisions, moving in the right direction, toward a warm tent that he would never ever see. It is hard to reconcile that image of a dying man with the careful professional who had walked these mountains for 30 long years. He was the careful one, the guide who never lost a client, the man who treated every step like a high-stakes game of chess. But that is exactly what makes this story so powerful. proving that even the masters can fall prey to the mountain's cold trap. His story is a simple reminder that the mountains do not care about your resume or how many peaks you have stood upon. They do not care how experienced you are, because in the death zone, every single one of us is just meat and bone. The courage he showed in chasing his dreams inspires me, even if it led him straight into the arms of the frozen dark. He spent 3 decades pushing the boundaries of what is possible, dancing on the edge of the razor blade at extreme high altitude. He skied down mountains where most folks can barely walk, carving his name into the ice of the most dangerous peaks on Earth. He pioneered routes that changed the sport forever, doing it all with a quiet humility that is rare in a world of ego. But everyone is human in the end, and sometimes, despite our best plans, the mountain decides it is time to win the game. What do you reckon happened in those final frozen hours when the lights were going out inside his tired and swelling mind? Why did he tell her he was coming down when his boots were still climbing deeper into the throat of the night? Where did his skis go? Those 2 faithful companions that were supposed to carry him safely away from the grip of death. Did he see the lights of a city that wasn't there, beckoning him upward toward a warmth that only exists in dreams? When they finally found him days later, he was frozen in mid-step, as if he had just paused to catch his breath. Back at Camp 4, she sat alone in that flapping tent, staring at a radio that refused to speak a single word. She waited while the storm battered the nylon walls, listening to the wind screaming like 1,000 lost souls outside her door. Every hour that passed was another nail in the coffin, another layer of ice forming over the small flicker of hope remaining. She realized with a sinking heart that no helicopter was coming to save him from the clutches of the high mountain storm. She was trapped there too, running out of fuel and water, slowly realizing that soon, there might be 2 bodies to find. She realized if she stayed any longer at Camp 4, there would be 2 frozen corpses for the rescue team to bring down. She did not just pack her own gear, she gathered up his sleeping bag and tent, stuffing them deep into her heavy pack. She carried his ghost down the mountain with her, hauling his equipment through the snow just in case he was still alive somewhere. She walked down through Camp 3 and Camp 2, fighting the exhaustion that tried to pull her down into the soft white snow. When she finally stumbled into base camp 3 days later, she looked like a woman who had seen the other side of hell. She was physically and emotionally destroyed, writing later that no one moved a single finger to help him when he needed it most. The helicopter finally arrived at the mountain on May 29th, 4 long days after his radio went silent forever in the cold dark. 5 Sherpas geared up with oxygen masks to search the death zone, moving fast to reach his last known location on the map. They climbed up to 27,200 feet, scanning the white expanse for a splash of red against the endless snow. But when they reached the spot where he said he was, they found nothing but empty ice and the howling of the wind. They had to push higher, climbing past the point of safety into the thin air, where all hope begins to freeze and die. Then they saw it. A dark shape lying in the snow at 27,559 feet, motionless and cold. It was him, lying face down in the ice, preserved perfectly by the cold, like a statue toppled over in a lonely graveyard. He was still wearing his crampons and his heavy pack, strapped tight to his back, as if he was just taking a nap. His headlamp was still on his helmet, and his legs were positioned like he was about to take one more step forward. There were no broken bones, no signs of a fall or an avalanche, just a man who paused and never moved again. But here is the thing that makes no sense, because he was found 330 feet higher than where he said, and his skis were nowhere to be found, meaning he was not descending to his depot, but climbing up into the black void. They flew his frozen body to Kathmandu for an autopsy that revealed his brain and lungs were swollen with his own fluid. High-altitude cerebral edema had tricked his mind, swelling his brain until reality warped, and the path down looked like the path up. He likely felt strong and capable in those final moments, unaware that he was actually drowning on dry land miles above the earth. His brain betrayed him in the dark, convincing him that the path to salvation lay upward into the storm instead of down to safety. The mountain took him in the end, claiming one of the best skiers in the world as a permanent resident of the silent death zone.